Okay, next we have Vivek Bharadwaj from University of California, Berkeley. He's in the field of HPC and scientific computing, and his advisors are James Demel and Aidan Bullock. And he did his practicum at National Renewable Energy Laboratory. Please welcome Vivek.
Thank you so much for the introduction. It's great to be here, and this talk features 5 other CSGFers, so there'll be some familiar faces. Let's get started. Okay, so a little bit about me first. So I study computer science at UC Berkeley, and my interests are linear algebra, sparse kernels, and in particular, I like studying tensor kernels. So a tensor is just a multidimensional array that generalizes a matrix, which is 2D, and a vector, which is one-dimensional. And some of my past projects have involved sort of high-dimensional analogs of the singular value decomposition or principal component analysis, extended to these 3+ dimensional objects, scaling linear algebra on large clusters, distributed memory graph algorithms. And what I will say that I am emphatically not, like Alex said, she's not a physicist, I am not a chemist, computational, otherwise, or any other type. But on my flight to the 2024 program review, I sat next to one, Tristan Maxon. And Tristan spent the whole first part of the flight very generously telling me about a problem that we had started looking at, but he really crystallized a lot of the details. And he was very generous with his time, given sort of a complete lack of experience on my part. Tristan's problem is one that a lot of you in this room kind of care about, so I want to explain it to you a little bit. Given a set of atoms, some configurations of atoms in space, some molecule set, for example, what I would like to do is I want to somehow predict the potential energy of this whole system, as well as the forces on each atom. If I get these objects, especially the forces, I can feed that to something like lamps and conduct some molecular dynamics simulation and predict some properties of a material. And now traditional methods to do this, for example, density functional theory, they can be very computationally intensive, but fortunately we've realized that neural networks are very good universal function approximators. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to feed in the atomic metadata and the positions into this deep graph neural network, and it's going to predict the relevant quantities for us. And now here's the constraint. I want our network to respect certain physical laws. We'd like to respect things like energy conservation and symmetry. And we're going to focus on symmetry in this talk. So a little primer on what a message-passing graph neural network does. So a graph neural network takes in a graph, and each node here represents an atom position. And it's got this dense feature vector, that's this array of numbers on each node. And it's got an array of numbers on each edge as well, which represents a pairwise interaction. The message-passing graph neural network is going to combine these 2 pieces of information for each edge, a node feature and an edge feature, using some kind of interaction, and it's going to sum up the results across the neighborhood of each node. Rinse and repeat, and that's your network. And here's the property that I want to enforce. It's called O3 equivariance. And that basically means that if I rotate a molecule in space, the energy that I predict should not change, and the forces that I predict on each atom should rotate compatibly. To do this, we need to combine the node and edge features in this highly structured manner that I've sort of illustrated with this little box here, and let's zoom in and see exactly what that interaction is. This is called the Klebsch-Gordon tensor product. I'm going to refer to this whole operation as the CG tensor product. And the idea here is that I take this node feature, x, and this edge feature, y, and I combine them using this 3D sparse tensor. This is called a tensor contraction operation. I can write this just as a matrix multiplication by this, the flattened tensor P against this Kronecker product of x and y, and then I post-multiply it by this trainable weight matrix W that's highly structured. And here you can just see that I've written it out as a summation. That's it. That's the whole of this operation. And the key here is that I need to execute millions of these operations, but the payoff here is that I get a neural network model that is invariant to rotations, and the forces are equivariant to these rotations, and that's very powerful. And here's the problem. Our GPUs are highly optimized for dense gem. That's what pays the bills at NVIDIA. And they're not optimized for this block sparse tensor contraction. This CG tensor product can consume 80% of your model's runtime. It will run at less than 10% of the GPU's utilization, which is a terrible waste all around. And this is far from some arcane lab experiment. These equivariant models are pretty mainstream. There's the NQUIP model. I think it was one of the first. Bowen Jing here, who has worked on diffdoc, that's this molecular docking code. Sam Blau, who's an alum, his group develops MACE, the foundation model trained on a variety of atoms. And let's not forget, Albie Musselian was a 2023 Gordon Bell finalist for an equivariant neural network. And so here's our contribution to this canon. We are going to present open equivariance, and that's this GPU kernel generator for that CG tensor product that I showed you earlier. It's got something like a 10x speed up over the best open source codes for this problem, and it performs now on par with NVIDIA's closed source package coequivariance. But when they first released it, we were something like 2 times faster, and they've since caught up with us. End to end, it gives us something like a 5 to 6 times speed up to train these large foundation models with, again, an order of magnitude smaller memory footprint. 76 GitHub stars, so it's getting some adoption, and this is work done in collaboration with my advisors and Austin Glover at Berkeley. I want to tell you a little bit about how we did this. So recall that I had this sort of block-sparse tensor contraction that I showed you earlier, where there was this cube and these small blue blocks floating around in there. I'm going to break the computation into segments, one per small non-zero block, and it turns out that each of those blocks has a very intricate structure that you can see here on the left. There are all these repeating patterns, and the key here is that we know the structure entirely when we define the model, and that's some structure that we can exploit to do efficient computation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to break the computation into small segments, and I'm going to exploit the repeating structures inside each of these blocks. And here on the right, I've sort of illustrated what these little primitives, what these block contractions look like, and the key here is these blocks are very small. They're less than 10 in side length. Okay, and so here is in one slide the roadmap that we use to develop these efficient CG kernels. Recall that we need to execute millions of these operations, a very large batch of these. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take all of my batch elements, I'm going to distribute one element to one GPU warp. So if you're not familiar with GPU architecture, a warp is a group of 32 threads on a GPU that's kind of like a tiny execution engine. And I can execute these warps completely asynchronously and independently from each other. Okay, and so this is like a very cheap way to parallelize the computation. Let's zoom in and see what each of these tiny execution engines actually does to do the computation. So when we zoom in here, I now run into a new problem, and that's that each warp has a very limited pool of SRAM or fast memory. So what am I going to do to sort of shepherd this small pool? Well, I generate a schedule of computation to manage that shared memory usage and minimize global to SRAM traffic. And then I load some segments of X and Y, I execute some computation, I flush some of the outputs, and I repeat. So that's great. Now let's zoom in one more time and see what does it take to actually execute one of those small blocks. Well, at this point, recall that the side lengths of those blocks are really small. So what I can do is I can stick the small pieces of X and Y into the fastest memory that the GPU can offer, the registers. And that allows me to really unroll the inner loop and write out a very long stream of instructions, almost all of which are just arithmetic. I do multiply, multiply, add, and when I look at the GPU assembly code, PTX, I get a very efficient kernel. So that sounds very complicated, but at the bottom level, it's not a very complicated algorithm. So here I've written out what the kernel actually looks like. The code isn't too much more complicated than this. And the key line here is that for every IJK value in the tensor, which I unroll this loop using a JIT compiler, I accumulate to one value after doing 2 multiplications. That's an incredibly simple algorithm, but it turns out it gets you very good performance. Now, of course, this is a machine learning algorithm, so you not only need this forward pass, but you need the gradient calculation or backward pass. But it turns out this is almost identical. It's just 3 update equations instead of 1, and we're not even going to go through this. What's more interesting, though, is that for these types of models, you actually need higher order derivatives to train these things. So recall, this is sort of like a high school physics fact, that if I have the predicted energy of my model as a function of the atomic positions R and the weights here of my trainable neural network model, the derivative of this energy with respect to the atomic positions R is the force on each atom. And it shouldn't be surprising to you that if I'm trying to optimize the difference between the predicted and the ground truth forces with respect to the weights, a second derivative pops up. And this is rather annoying. PyTorch is very happy to do this for you. It doesn't care, second derivative, third derivative, it'll do it all. The problem is you need to actually specify a double backward pass because we're hand engineering this kernel. And this is very dispiriting. It's like we did all this work for the forward and backward passes. Do we need to write a whole additional kernel? The complexity is just spiraling out of control. And the key that we show in our paper is you don't need any additional kernel engineering to do this. You can express this higher order derivative calculation using a linear combination of the forward and backward calls that we've already engineered. In other words, I call backward 4 times, I call forward 3 times, and then I just take linear combinations of these things, and that lets us get the gradients with respect to the loss that I need to optimize this model. Great. Okay, so we've really cut our work down. The final optimization among several that I want to talk about is this idea of kernel fusion. So GPUs are really efficient when they're doing calculation and when they're not moving data back and forth. And kernel fusion, which is combining multiple phases of computation, is one powerful tool to do this. So recall that this whole CG tensor product is running in the context of this graph neural network model that's doing this summation operation across the neighborhood of each node that's known as graph convolution. Well, it turns out that graph convolution is a very well-studied pattern. The pattern is identical to sparse times dense matrix multiplication, and HPC researchers have really exploited many properties of this kernel to design very efficient SPMM algorithms. So by combining the CG tensor product with classic algorithms for sparse times dense matrix multiplication, we can save significant amounts of end-to-end runtime as well as memory. And here I've sort of sketched out the algorithm. No need to stare too closely at this. I'll just highlight the major parts, which is we execute the subkernel sequence. That's exactly what I showed you earlier. And here we only write out to the global memory when we transition from one row of the graph adjacency matrix to another. And that's what lets us save a lot of memory traffic. Okay. So that's sort of like a high-level view of 3 major contributions, and you can read the paper for more. I want to get to the results. So we conducted our experiments on NERSC Perlmutter with the A100 GPUs, and this is a cross-platform kernel generator, so it's not like Q-equivariance where you can only do NVIDIA GPUs. We could also run this on AMD's architecture. So we also ran our experiments on the MI250 GPUs on OLCF Frontier. And I want to talk first about the throughput of these kernel generators. So here in blue, I've shown the throughput, so higher is better, of the best open source code, E3NN. Yellow is NVIDIA's package, Q-equivariance, and green is ours. And I've plotted this for multiple data types, float32 and float64, for the forward and backward pass. And you can see here that we're holding our own against Q-equivariance in many cases. In many cases, we're doing better. Otherwise, we're sort of on par. And again, we are significantly better than the open source code, which you can sort of barely see some of the performance there. And these configurations are lifted from a lot of these protein docking codes and chemical foundation models. These trends hold across architectures. So those last experiments were conducted on the A100 nodes on NERSC Perlmutter, and here I can show you what is the isolated tensor product runtime across 3 different GPUs. We tried an NVIDIA budget board, the A5000, as well as the MI250X on Frontier, and these trends hold. We are offering you an order of magnitude advantage over the open source code and on par performance with the closed source package where it is available. On the right here, you can see a roofline plot, and the y-axis here is throughput, so this is performance in teraflops per second, and the x-axis here I've plotted arithmetic intensity for a variety of configurations. That's the number of flops I perform per data word moved. And what this line basically says is this is the maximum theoretical performance I can achieve on the A100 system. And you can see here that our kernels and the latest version of Q-equivariance, we are achieving very high utilization in the bandwidth limited portion of this curve. So we're doing really well. We're using a large fraction of the machine resources. And this is an older version of Q-equivariance. We're much better than that. But again, they caught up. When NVIDIA released their package, I was sort of freaking out, and no one was sort of returning my emails, but this guy did. So Santiago rented my house when he went to Berkeley for his practicum. And he put me in contact with the developers of Mace. And so here are the results. So we put our kernels into the Mace Foundation model, and here's the end-to-end simulation speed in megatime steps per day. Again, we are offering a significant advantage over the open source code. End-to-end, it's like a 5 to 6 times speed up. Our kernels are the green bars here, light green and dark green. Now here, Q-equivariance is doing better, but this is mainly because they've optimized some kernels that are specific to Mace. And you can see that by looking at the runtime breakdown on the right. Here you can see that on the kernels that we really optimize, we're performing on parity with their closed source package. Okay. So I want to close by telling you how you can use this if you are interested. We are now officially integrated into Nequip and Mace. So you can use these kernels with the flip of a switch just by changing your config file to say enable open equivariance. You can get the gains that we've engineered. It's a pip installable package, so if you'd like to engineer something without going through these frameworks, you can do that. I want to highlight that again, we see a consistent 5 to 6 time end-to-end speed up and significantly less memory due to that kernel fusion optimization. And we used a variety of low-level programming techniques to achieve this. And tentative future work includes like supporting jacks, performance tuning on AMD, things like that. But rather, I think the meta lesson here is how fruitful the collaboration between domain scientists and computational scientists can be. I certainly enjoyed working on this. It sort of gave me a lot of fulfillment. So I want to thank everyone who sort of gave me advice over the course of this. And I also want to thank the Krell staff as well as all the people I've met. It's been really nice over the past 4 years. So that's it. You can scan the code if you'd like to look for the package, and you can read the paper as well. Thank you so much, and I'll take any questions.